Where roosters and hens roamed free on the acres of green land, sat a tiny house in the middle of nowhere. Inside there was a woman named Marianne Edgewood. She had a fair complexion with long, brown hair draped around her shoulders, while her eyes were soft but deep brown. Hunched over, embodying characteristics of sadness, she seemed to be much older than in reality. In fact, the young woman was only 38. Marianne was beautiful at one time, but a missing void tore at her, wearing her down. Instead of being youthful and bright, she lived her life as an older woman, walking slowly, sleeping more and more, hardly eating, staying shut in, and distancing herself from the community. 19 years ago, Marianne was a bright, lively, and wondrous adult. No one would have known that in a year the young adult everyone knew would change so drastically. Ever since the day she was gifted with a baby boy, Anthony, she was in her glory. When he was born, she was over the moon in happiness. His eyes were a chocolate brown, with soft patches of dirty brown hair on top of his head. His smile brought joy and ignited everything in his presence. To most, he was perfect, a little bundle of joy. But for Marianne, being only 19, many discouraged her to raise the child. Many expressed their concern for the child's health, usually saying,
"You wouldn't want the child to grow up in an environment that cannot support him, let alone his mother, would you?"
For a long time, she was able to take the comments and criticisms lightly. But once the city council got involved, things started going awry. In the town of Tenby, where she lived, the government was run by believers, people who lived by a strict way of life. They valued the normal procedure of living: get married, have kids, then die. When the news broke that one of the town girls had a child, especially at 19, the believers, as they like to be called, felt order had to be pursued to prevent this from happening again. Unbeknownst to Marianne, the believers planned on removing Anthony from her possession. The day Anthony was scheduled to be removed happened to be one of the most glorious days ever seen. There was not a cloud to be seen in the clear blue sky. For Marianne, it happened all so fast. One moment she was answering her door, and the next she was yelling for her son. His cries filled the air as a group of believers, cloaked in all black, whisked the baby away. Distraught, Marianne ran outside of the house, screaming,
"He is my son! You have no right! You cannot take him! He is mine!"
Pitying her, one of the believers, a tall, statured figure, stepped away from the group with piercing eyes and said,
"My dear child, it is with a heart so heavy to tear this child away from his mother. It shouldn't have to happen like this. Only if you weren't so naive and stupid would this not have happened. Remember, it will always be your fault. Good day, my child."
Returning to the group and walking away, Marianne ached in pain and anger. Her eyes burned with fury as she rushed to the believers wanting her child. Forced to stop in her tracks, she met the end of the gun. The same figure who laughed so carelessly at Marianne ordered her to be removed back to her house. Being grabbed by her arms, two other figures of the group dragged her away. Fighting with all her might, she soon found how tiring it was, ending in her weeping for her son. Thrown like a doll through her front door, Marianne found herself sitting in the front room. Her anguish was too great for her. She only wished for a way to see her son again. To Marianne, that day that held a clear blue sky was now empty and dull, filled with the agony of loss. Shortly, the news of Anthony being removed spread like wildfire in the small community. Marianne became well known as the outcast of the community, which attributed to her cutting herself from the world. Marianne's heart was shattered, and she felt it could be never repaired, so why would she attempt to make an effort? From then on, Marianne only left her house for the search to end her needs, and nothing else. Year after year after year, Marianne stayed locked inside, until one day she heard a loud knocking at her front door. Startled by the noise, she stayed seated at the kitchen table, hoping whoever it was at the wrong house. Breathing ever so slightly, Marianne began to relax as the knocking stopped. Just as she was about to continue to drink her tea, the knocking returned, but even louder. Frightened, she dropped the glass, letting it shatter to the floor. A voice was heard in response.
"Open up, please. It is dreadful out here."
The voice of a woman filled Marianne's ears, a voice with a hint of dismay. Coming to her senses, Marianne approached the door, unlocking it and turning the knob ever so slightly. Hardly opening the door, Marianne peeked out, greeted with an older woman. She seemed to be in her late 70s, with gray and white hair tangling atop of her head. She seemed no less than the average height of 5'4", as she was dressed in a coat made of patches. Startled by the sight, Marianne questioned the old lady.
I'm sorry, but you must have the wrong house. What are you doing out here?
Smiling ever so slightly, the old lady chuckled.
I'm sure I'm at the right place. You are Marianne Edgewood, aren't you?
Stunned, Marianne opened the door, fully allowing the old lady to welcome herself inside.
How do you know my name?
Settling down, the old lady went and sat in the kitchen.
Your son's birthday is today, am I right? He must be 19. It has to have been hard for you to not know anything about him. I could help you see your son if you learn to make an effort. All these years you have shunned away everyone, blaming them for taking away your son. But in fact, it wasn't them. You've isolated yourself in hopes of this pain to go away. If you want to see your son and know him, you must rekindle your relationship with the outside. That is my only request.
Hours went by as Marianne and the old lady went back and forth on the simple request. Marianne kept disagreeing, always blaming the people in her community, until she was forced to choose. And in the end, Marianne agreed to the request in hopes to see her son again. As days went by since the visit of the old lady, Marianne finally got the courage to go into town. While approaching the town, Marianne's heart tightened. She saw the smiles of hundreds and heard laughter. Tormented by the sight and noise, she had a change of heart. Instead of going there to accept the truth of the matter, she ended up being filled with hatred. To her, these people that were so happy and joyous, she'd be feeling the pain of loss, just like her. Her anger rose and rose until she lost the sight of the request. Her heart had slowly fallen away inside her. The hatred that was building inside her over 19 years became too fast for her to even think of her son. Standing there, deep in her heart, she wished pain and suffering on all the people before her. Unbeknownst, the very wish she made had destroyed her chances of ever seeing her beloved son again. She had cursed herself with everlasting pain. For the rest of eternity, Marianne was forever going to be alone, a lost soul, bound to be forgotten.